Module 7, Technology That Liberated and Enslaved. This is a module I thought a lot about as I prepared this course. I thought about how do you tell the story of the technological advances in the 20th century and tell it so that it makes sense. And I think the title helps us because every step of the way we had an anticipation, whether it was the automobile, the telephone, or whatever it was, medical technology, that we would be more free. And it turns out every single new instrumentality and technology seems to tie us down a little bit, seems to enslave us. In these past 100 years of the 20th century, we have seen remarkable advances in technology. It was 1903 when the Wright brothers, in December of that year, had sustained manned powered flight. And then it was 1947, just some 40 years later, that Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in a jet plane. It was just an amazing time in that first half a century and in the second half. We're still adjusting. You are slaves to your technology. You are made free by your technology. And this is something that we have to examine to understand the 20th century. Charlie Chaplin does that brilliantly. This was a time in 1936 in his movie Modern Times when he shows how technology provide tyranny over the workers. The workers are there like he was, tightening bolts with his wrenches, and they seem to be human aspects of machines. They seem to be reduced to just another cog in the wheel, as he shows here. There's even an automatic eating machine that someone suggests could help the workers move more quickly through the lunch hour. I'll show you some of this clip, or you can go visit it on YouTube. It's pretty funny, and it's pretty emblematic, I think. Now, this particular video that I will show you in class, I took a couple of years ago, about 8 years ago, while we were visiting the AnheuserBusch brewery in St. Louis. So after you watch Charlie Chaplin, it's kind of interesting to watch how few people there are on this automated line and how these beer bottles go rushing through. Now, radio seems to you as sort of the most ordinary kind of technology, but really in the 20th century, both for entertainment and for communications purposes, it was an incredible advance. Now, I focus mostly on the entertainment aspect right here. Of all the souvenirs I have from my teenage years, I wish I still had this Zenith portable radio that's shown here. I got this from a stock photo off the web, but that's exactly the transistor that I had. And it was great because I used to listen to the ball games. Here is Harry Carey down in the lower right-hand corner, broadcasting on KMOX in St. Louis. He was broadcasting the Cardinals games, and I was at home listening on my radio. And it just gave us an immediate quality to our life, a larger life. And then, of course, we're entertained by Jack Benny and Bob Hope and Judy Garland, and we're informed by Edward R. Murrow, the great newsman who made his first fame in writing and then on the radio and then in television. So this radio medium still is very important to us. And now, of course, the latest thing that you have are podcasts, which are nothing more than specialized radio broadcasts over the internet. It's amazing how everything old is new again. Speaking of old, 1929, DuPont company developed neoprene, a synthetic rubber. Now, that doesn't sound like much, except thank goodness for that discovery, because that discovery, in large measure, helped us to be able to get through World War II, because we could not get supplies of natural rubber from the Pacific and the other islands where they came. Having this artificial rubber, the synthetic rubber, was a great advantage to us. So when you have such discoveries, they may seem like minor conveniences, and a couple of years later, they may seem indispensable. For example, Dr. Otto Bayer developed polyurethane. What your lives would be without polyurethane. Your desktops and furniture and items of clothing and all these things depend on this magnificent plastic. And this was a time in which the frontiers of plastics technology and chemistry were pushing farther and farther forward. So we celebrate Dr. Bayer and polyurethane. Now this was a remarkable achievement. The satellites, Earth satellites. Of course, the first Earth satellite was 1957. It was a Russian satellite, Sputnik. But later we came with our own satellites. Telstar was the first civilian communications satellite. Syncom, what came a little bit later, and it was a military application. And what happened is there were physicists and there were science fiction writers like Arthur Clarke who said, you know, we know exactly the rate of spin that the Earth has on its axis. We know the 23.5-degree angle on which the axis sets. If we could put out as few as three satellites at sufficient distance, they would appear to be stationary as the Earth spun around. And that, in fact, is what we have now. All of our satellite broadcasts, television, telephones, all these other communications come from these satellites, most of which are in geosynchronous orbit, about 22.3 thousand miles from the Earth. A simple idea, a theoretical idea back in the 20s, and now it's practical. I can tell you when this Telstar came out, I remember in 1964 for the first time watching the Olympics in Tokyo, Japan, seeing the images bounced off the satellite and broadcast to us around the world. It was pretty remarkable. Speaking of remarkable, I was talking about the Wright brothers. Again, it wasn't but 53 years after the Wright brothers that I had my first airplane flight. And you see this TWA Constellation in the upper right-hand corner. That was the plane on which my brother and I flew with our dad between St. Louis and Cleveland. Now, we didn't get meals like are shown on this, but we also didn't fly in anything that looked like the Spirit of St. Louis. Charles Lindbergh, of course, crossed the Atlantic, solo flight. May 20th, 1927, he left. He flew directly to Orly Field in Paris, France, and claimed a $25,000 prize for the first person who could fly solo across. He was a great pioneer in aviation. Unfortunately, he had some bad political dimensions, but he was a great aviation pioneer. Now, here in the lower right-hand corner, I show a little clipping of Braniff Airlines. It's an airline that is now defunct, has gone out of business for quite a while, so you have no knowledge of it. But it also reminds me, the first jet flight I took was in September of 1965. I flew between Kansas City and Chicago, and I remember that flight quite well for its drama. So, air travel. Air travel is everywhere. We can fly everywhere, and it is a tremendous technology.